Well, thank you very much. So my own research over the years has been on financial markets and financial architectures, looking at the buy side of the market, the investment performance, and internationalization of financial instruments and financial markets, and also the trade equivalent, or the real sector equivalent of that. And done quite a bit of work on the European structure, especially since in anticipation of the euro, creating a financial market which is a good rival to the US and Asia. So along the way, I talked to a publisher in London, and he said, you know, there's a lot of problems with data, with the reliability of information in terms of forming monetary policy or financial structure issues. And there are a lot of flows that are either not registered, not picked up, or they're faulty. And when you make decisions based on faulty information, the consequences are pretty obvious. So I thought about this and about the whole issue of non-disclosure. Why would people or institutions not disclose information? What are their objectives? What are the consequences of that? And I decided years ago to write a book on this. And this is what are the objectives of financial secrecy? Why do people not disclose? And it's pretty obvious. You can come up with a list. What are the consequences of financial disclosure in different circumstances? What's the role of privacy, for example, within a household? Do you want financial information to be distributed or to be leaked to family members like kids? There are consequences to that. What about if you're operating in partnership with other people in a business firm? Do you want to have full disclosure between the partners of financial information from both sides? Obviously, there are tax reasons and tax evasion, and to some extent, tax avoidance. There's a difference between evasion and avoidance. Depends in part on how much information tax authorities are able to acquire. And then there are legal issues in terms of civil law, being sued or being subject to a class action suit in the United States is a very, very important risk for business firms, and depend in part on information access by the authorities. And that's certainly true in the case of criminal law. So if you just think of agents and principals in the system, there's lots of reasons why non-disclosure could be valuable. And that's certainly true in the case of bribery, graft, corruption, and so forth, with respect to disclosure of information by public servants and the like. So if you just think about it from a demand point of view, there are lots of reasons to try to maintain confidentiality. And I was trying to look around for things that have been written about this, especially by competent economists and financial people, and nobody really tackled this. And I thought there's a way to build this into a conceptual framework that's consistent with financial economics. The consequences include family disruption. It could be litigation or retribution by those who are not subject to the information that's not disclosed. And there could be penalties of various kinds, including civil and criminal penalties. And then there's a whole issue of reputation. What's the reputational consequence of information that could be damaging to a firm or or to a family and so forth. So there's plenty of reasons for financial secrecy to evolve, and partly it's just human nature. My financial business is my business, and your financial business is your business. And it's a matter of privacy, almost like a human right, to be able to retain information that you don't want disclosed and possibly lead to some of these consequences. So you're looking for ways of doing that. And I focus a lot on the international issue, the international dimensions of this. If you want privacy, just open a bank account. Depending on your country, you receive a certain amount of financial confidentiality through that. Not everybody has access to your bank account. But under certain circumstances, it could well be that you're sued by somebody, and that in a court of law leads to disclosure of the bank account, which otherwise would be fine from a disclosure point of view, but now is no longer. So possibly you might go to different markets which provide better secrecy, but usually there are certain risks involved. And the person that you trust not to disclose your information is called an agent. This is called an agency problem. He is your agent, and by that he acquires a certain amount of power. And he could possibly mismanage your assets, or he could possibly, either in terms of return, he could also steal from you, or just in terms of the risk associated with the portfolio. So you might end up with a more risky portfolio, but one which has a certain amount of confidentiality. But somebody has to do that, and that's your agent. So there's a big agency issue in this. So internationally, you can acquire some additional confidentiality because you're outside the legal regime of your home country. So here's some motivations internationally. You might just live in a number of different countries. You might have an international business. You may be worried about your own economy, possible future devaluations of financial crisis or whatever, which would motivate you to move funds abroad. Currency stability is another one. Political risk. Kidnapping, if you are obviously a major Brazilian business person, you're concerned about possible criminal action against you or against your family, including kidnapping and so forth. So that is another incentive to move funds abroad and maintain confidentiality while you're doing it. So there are a bunch of different reasons like that, including normal ones like diversification, possibly family issues, which could be a problem within your country, but can be avoided by moving funds outside. And it could also be a tax evasion. And remember, I use the word here, evasion, not avoidance. So that in order to achieve that, you have to violate something, and you're violating the tax code, and in some cases you're violating foreign exchange controls that your home country may have imposed. So you can sort of see from the international point of view, there's plenty of motivation for confidentiality to become important in terms of financial flows. On the other hand, and all of those green ones are sort of logical. They're day-to-day issues that you have to contend with. With respect to the red ones, you have obviously criminal. You have a special business, like, for example, various scams, smuggling and trafficking in drugs and in people, and other kinds of things like human organs and weapons and terrorists. They all require secrecy. And if you think about some of the more recent events, including 9/11, when you trace back those funds, they're extraordinarily small in size, but they were absolutely essential for that particular event to have occurred. And of course, there's the whole issue of insider trading, which tries to undermine the integrity of the capital markets. When you look at the US track record on insider trading prosecutions, every single one of those involved a Swiss account. The funds that were involved in that cycle at some point had touched the Swiss financial markets. That says, given Switzerland's secrecy characteristics, that's an important issue with respect to the integrity of your own equity market, for example. And then, of course, you got corruption among officials at the ministerial level. So there are lots of sort of green ordinary issues, and then a lot of issues which have less transparent aspects to them. And so you can sort of figure out where those demands come from, what the value is of confidentiality on the green side or the red side, and you come to the conclusion that there's got to be a really active market in financial confidentiality. I mean, if you think about just in my home territory, you just look at the street drug business. So we're at New York University, right in front of the park, Washington Square Park. People offer you drugs all the time, even an old guy like me. And it's paid for in street cash, which means 20s, 10s, 20s and 10s mostly, dollar bills. When you think about the total size of that market, you're going to have hundreds of tons of currency notes that need to be recycled somehow, that need to flow back into the financial system. You think about the logistical process of that. 10,000 tons of 50s, what do you do with them? How do you do that? You hire some people, they deposit in a bank, $9,999, which is just below the federal, in our case, the federal deposit reporting requirement. And then you get that much in, and then you credit it to a drug dealer account or whatever. But that's not going to handle the volumes. So over the years, been a lot of currency shipments, and we know part of them, mostly Panama and countries like that, where you basically have outflows of currency notes in flights, maybe an old DC-3 flying to Panama City, and then the funds being deposited in Panamanian institutions. Panamanian institution redeposits in an American institution, and it flows back through the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia, to the credit of the financial intermediary. So we know what the ultimate number looks like, but we don't know what the flows look like. So this is kind of the demand side, legitimate, illegitimate, and some of the consequences. So basically, what you've got is a domestic environment related to income and wealth. That wealth is, to some extent, information sensitive, and so it has to be transferred to another environment where the issues are, what's the tax environment for non-residents? That's why countries with, particularly in the Caribbean and so on, with relatively light taxation, what's their local civil and legal environment look like? Are there extradition treaties in place so that you could be extradited from that country to the US if that's where the source of funds are? And then to what extent are there products around? Trusts, shell companies, that can be layered or stacked on top of each other in a way that makes it virtually impossible to find the ultimate owner of the assets. So this is the one issue. What does the host environment look like? What's the home environment look like? And to what extent are there cross-border treaties in place or cross-border agreements in place that would permit confiscation and or extradition of the owner of the assets. So I think it's pretty complicated, and what you're looking for is environments and examples. In the US, we've had a number of them recently. One is Paul Manafort, who was actively involved in political campaigns in the last cycle, essentially taking Ukrainian funds, which were of criminal origin, and then shipping them through someplace, in this case Cyprus. Cyprus is one of the major transit points for Russian illicit gains, and then moved to the US either directly or through tax havens, mostly in the Caribbean. And in this case, ultimately was made visible, and the consequences were pretty significant. More recently, we have basically currency manipulation or exchange rate manipulation with respect to Russia. There are a lot of wealthy Russians, and their objective here was to take ruble bonds denominated in Russian currency, and convert them into US dollar or mostly euro bonds through accounts that were set up in the Baltic countries. And one of the major players here was a bank, the Danske Bank, which is the largest bank in Denmark at the time. And this is basically a washing process. You basically convert the rubles into US and then match it on the other side. And you can sort of see that that got pretty significant back in the mid-decade. Lots of other banks got involved in this marginally, but the Danske Bank, which is otherwise a pretty harmless institution, was right in the middle of it, and the rest of them largely pulled out of that market once the prosecutional heat began to develop, and they continued it for much longer than anybody else. And you can see what you would expect to happen happened if you take a look at the share price of the Danske Bank. I mean, here's a retail or local universal bank in an otherwise peaceful environment involved in this particular kind of transaction focused on the risk aversion or attempt by Russians with very little due diligence with respect to the source of the funds. So you see these things come up once in a while, particularly in the tax area. If you look at the tax evasion estimates, if you take the US as the largest single, well, it's the largest single market, so you would expect it there. But other countries, if you take it as a percentage of GDP, is significantly higher. So on the left-hand side, if you just take the European environment, Italy is probably the largest with respect to source of funds related to tax evasion. Russia, of course, is very large. But even Germany you normally would expect to be tax compliant, but over the years, there's plenty of opportunity for Germans to move funds into tax providers, tax evasion providers, particularly in Switzerland. So you've got those kinds of issues of where the funds come from. And of course, that says, where there's supply, where there's the demand, there's probably supply. So if you buy the argument that there's plenty of demand and plenty of sources of demand for tax evasion, and in plenty of environments under lots of different circumstances, you would expect a supply function to develop. And so 20 years ago, 1990, I wrote this book on this. Here's an economic problem. You got demand, you got supply. And that means you should be able to create an industry organizational picture of this market. And so this book became pretty popular. It was translated into about 4 or 5 languages. And it sold very well, especially at Heathrow Airport in London. If you go there, there's a big bookstore, and for about 4 or 5 weeks, this was on the front of the store, and people would buy it, and they bought it for the wrong reason, because a guy would buy a copy of the book, and then would go on the British Airways flight to Kennedy, and have his cocktails and have his aperitif and stuff. And then he would pull this book out of the seat pocket in front of him, expecting this to be a how-to manual. That is, what are the details on how to actually execute these transactions. And when he opened the book, he would see something like this. And when he saw that, he would take that book and throw it in the seat pocket in front of him, because this is not what he expected. He expected the instruction book. And then when the plane got to Kennedy, the cleaning people would clean it out and throw it away. So there was never a secondary market in this book. So it sold about twice as many copies as I thought it would, for the wrong reason. So, but basically here's the story. If you build this into an economic framework or economic model, so you have risk and return. I flipped the axis so the safety is on the right-hand side. The lower the risk of the portfolio, the further you are to the right. And on the vertical is return. And normally you would operate on a plane that trades off risk and return, standard portfolio models. And if you add secrecy or confidentiality, you have another objective. And so you can add a vector, secrecy here, and now you've got to trade off return and risk and disclosure. And this is the way, if you were a student of economics, this is the way you would kind of look at this. And the market gives you what those trade-offs are. In this case, the market is not transparent, so it's very difficult in some cases to value confidentiality. That gives you the plane to operate on. And then your own preferences is like a bowl, the bottom of a bowl, which tells you how to trade off secrecy, return, and confidentiality. So what I try to do is then take this model and build it into different situations with respect to that. And I think that was like 20 years ago. I'm currently doing a update of that book. I'm late, so the publishers are after me. But nevertheless, it's a pretty robust way of looking at things. So when you have secrecy as an objective, you've got some problems. First of all, what are the logistics? How do you deal with the cash movements that I just mentioned briefly before? What options are there? How do you deal with cross-border complexity? If you want a higher level of secrecy, you might want an agent in the Bahamas or someplace to basically be your agent. And in that case, what is the risk, the additional risk involved in that? What about the regulators? In many cases, the regulators are looking for something else, but in the process, they catch you. This is what we call bycatch. So if they're classically after organized crime, and they're really after the underlying criminals in the investigative process, that could well be that you're capturing information with respect to secret secrecy-related flows, and that catches a lot of other people. So if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, and you're trying to find that needle, the whole haystack gets terribly disturbed. And if you happen to be, you're otherwise okay, but if you happen to be in that haystack, you got a problem. And we've seen lots and lots of cases like that of bycatch with respect to enforcement issues. Then you got questions of the agency issue that I talked about before. Who are you trusting? And how much power does that individual or firm have over your assets or your financial flows in terms of misappropriation or violation of efficient portfolios and so forth? And so you're always kind of under stress, and that's the picture of the woman here. She knows that they're looking. And that's a permanent issue. So she basically has a cost that she personally has to pay. And then the question is, what about the enforcement side? So we have plenty of significant improvement on the enforcement in the enforcement dimension. Most of this is actually focused on the OECD, which has done really very good work, both in terms of getting more reliable and particularly more consistent data. When they increase their anti-money laundering efforts, obviously there's an issue for those involved. And as far as the financial institutions are concerned, the whole question of enforcement and compliance is a huge issue. It's very, very expensive. And it's relatively frequent that it doesn't catch everything. And so we've had this question of compliance in the US market anyway among banks. And once in a while you see a major bank like Citibank or JP Morgan with a big headline that a particular relationship was not caught by their compliance people. And compliance is not only expensive, but it's what would you say, kind of troublesome. Because here you are as a banker, you're trying to do a good job. But meantime, the compliance people are saying, well, if you take a look at that particular transaction or that particular client, and that, of course, goes all the way back to Donald Trump, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. And that means a certain amount of return and market share goes away as a result of not doing stuff that you otherwise would have done. So it's problematic from a strategy point of view, and it's problematic from a cost point of view. But nevertheless, for the underlying client, it's a major issue. And then there's the issue of extraterritoriality. The U.S. is often accused of kind of throwing its weight around and investigating certain things which are domestic on the environmental side or on the criminal law side, and then implicitly imposing that on other countries. I think to a large extent it's probably true, but the U.S. getting religion on these issues, including the passage of a couple of major pieces of legislation under the so-called Patriot Act and under FATCA on reporting, has become a major disturbance and also a significant cost point from the point of view of the financial services industry. So here's a pretty good one. These are the Panama Papers all the way back to 2016. And this was kind of interesting because the lack of information is so high. You can speculate about costs and benefits and all that, but if you don't have good numbers, well, you're never going to have good numbers because secrecy is so important in this. Nevertheless, there's this international consortium of journalists. I think it was started by Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany that kind of went after this and depended heavily on leakage. So the leaked documents floated around with respect to financial transactions and assets in Panama. And you can sort of see the numbers are pretty significant. So they had $1.5 million, sorry, 1.5 million leaked documents that they were working with involving offshore clients in Panama. There was another batch of leaks in 2020. Shell companies, clearly a major factor in the Panamanian, historically, in the Panamanian financial system, where the ultimate owner was not or could not be identified. And then ultimately, once the documents were leaked, the people involved were just absolutely amazing. So you have former heads of state, major political figures in different countries, otherwise prominent business people or sports figures and so on, all using the secrecy conduit, using Panama as the focal point. So everybody apologizes and so forth, and this kind of goes by, and then it comes back in 2020, and sort of you can see here, again, another major release of confidential information brought about by the same financial journalists. And you can see the number of files released and so forth, documents, image, spreadsheets, and the like. In this case, and this is only 3 years later, 330 public officials and politicians in various countries were involved through Panamanian shell loops in order to provide financial confidentiality. So what do you want to do? If you have the motivations that I mentioned before, you want to increase the degree of confidentiality, what do you want? You want to find a place that is appropriate and cost-effective to do that. Well, so if you look at the supply side, what you want is a country that, or an environment which has statutory confidentiality in as high a level of governance as possible, possibly in the constitution of the country. So that means you want statutory confidentiality, you want a history and a tradition with very, very rare leakage. So you don't want a country that suddenly announces that it's going to be a secrecy haven, which only has 6 months of history behind it. You want a country that has 50 years, 100 years of confidentiality. So that's important. And the government of that country has to have some regulatory forbearance. It's not going to look as carefully as other countries might into financial flows. What else? It has to be politically stable. It has to be competent in the banking system. It has to have currency convertibility and exchange rate stability, because you don't want to place your funds in an environment where possibly there could be a major disruption, macro disruption, or possibly exchange rates or whatever. And then you want non-residents to be taxed favorably, obviously as low as possible. And then you want a country that's not totally dependent on other countries with respect to disclosure. So there are small countries that can be very easily, technically anyway, easily pressured by the United States to disclose. Why? Because you could have a number of different policies, such as discouraging tourists from going there and stuff like that. And that is something that you don't want as a secrecy secret, to be in a country that has that kind of potential pressure from the home countries. So where is that? Well, so this is my list of countries that have some of those attributes. And there's obviously Switzerland. Then you got Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein, if you've been there, you know the front of your car is out of the country before the back comes in. Tiny little country, but heavily linked into the Swiss financial system. But they have a number of different institutions, including foundations, that you can use in a stack of interrelated secrecy measures. So you can have accounts, foundations, very rare to be able to identify or to associate the name of an individual with the actual assets. So that's how Liechtenstein, to a large extent, exists. To a less extent, Luxembourg. They got Andorra and two Channel Island countries. And then you have others around in Singapore with a significantly less, significantly more transparent system, and so forth. So you have all those, and even in the United States. So one of the big secrecy havens, if you look at the numbers, is Miami. So you have a Colombian client or whatever it is with a Miami account, and as long as he's in compliance with US rules, that provides a significant amount, probably not perfect, but nevertheless, of confidentiality. And even in the United States, this was an interesting one that I got involved with some years ago. We have Indian nations. So Indian tribes, they're typically called nations. So there's the Sioux Nation and the Dakota Nation and so forth. And they decided that they would try to create a Switzerland inside the United States using Indian law, not American law. And so you could see the potential here for a domestic black hole into which secrecy-driven funds would go. So we had a meeting out in South Dakota with the local Indians and with the Treasury people, IRS people, and it was pretty clear this was not going to work. Because if you're going to create a nation which has a particular set of constraints with respect to financial flows, it's very unlikely that the federal government is not going to do something that will persuade you not to do that. There's plenty of external constraints on that. So they eventually, obviously, dropped the idea. So the perfect combination would be the Swiss. If you go through that checklist, fantastic with respect to secrecy laws and blocking statutes. They're in the Swiss Constitution. You've got a really well-developed, highly developed economy with a long history of democracy and political stability, stable currency, home to a major international bank. I should probably update this because Credit Suisse doesn't exist anymore. And then we have client coverage, lots of specialists in wealth management, many of which you probably haven't heard of, like Lombard Odier and Julius Baer and so forth. And good financial technology or financial knowledge and relationship skills worldwide. And then it's a good place to visit. So if you have an anonymous account in Switzerland, you're not going to get any mail from them, depending on the arrangements. But you can go to Switzerland and visit your money, and at the same time have some good food. So Switzerland has about 30 of the confidentiality-driven cross-border funds, about 30% market share. And this is great for Switzerland. It's a good industry. It's clean, no environmental damage. It's human capital intensive. You need a lot of smart people to do that. And it obviously has a driver or a factor propelling this, which is very hard to replicate. So it was a couple of years ago, we went down to Busan. Chang and I, they wanted to create Switzerland and Korea in Busan. And my job was to try to explain to them how difficult it is and how it may not fit into the successful Korean model that already exists in order to try to capture this kind of a benefit in a completely different industry with completely different drivers. So I don't know how Busan is done, but I suspect it's not very far along. So if we look at the Swiss funds, offshore versus onshore of assets, both banking assets and non-banking assets. So you can see how important those funds are. You can look at others, which are much more secrecy focused in their economic structures, like Channel Islands and so on. It's even significantly more than that. So this is what the flows look like in terms of sources of funds. Western Europe is the most heavily represented. And then in terms of destinations, Switzerland is number one, and then you can see the other ones down the line. So that's kind of an industry, but there have been problems. So here we have a couple that I'm now talking about from the point of the leader, from the point of Switzerland, of the Jewish money in Germany, which flowed to Switzerland back in the 1930s, before World War II, and eventually got placed with various Swiss institutions. And then the owners of that money, who were Germans, mostly were killed in the Holocaust. And you really didn't have any trails as to who, for some of those funds, as to who actually was the owner of it. So now what do you do? Because they were all dead. Now what do you do? How do you create a somewhat fair system for taking those funds, which had been on the balance sheet of these Swiss banks all those years, obviously paying interest, but the interest being accumulated as you go along, as you're trying to find the ultimate owners. As I said, most of them were dead, but some of them had migrated to Israel or some other place like that. And so this became a major reputational issue for the Swiss funds, for the Swiss banks. And they created a committee comprised of Paul Volcker. Some of you will remember him. He was one of the most admirable guys ever in public finance. And he tended to take some really dirty or difficult problems like the budget of the United Nations and things like that, and try to resolve them in a fair way. And Hans Baer was a son of Julius Baer, probably one of the most trusted wealth management individuals around. And they came around with a workable rough justice solution where the funds that could not ultimately be traced, ever, would be distributed to institutions and foundations and so forth to create some sort of a parity. Now, that's the best they could do, but I think in the history of banking, it was one of the best sort of statesman-like solutions to a real problem. Then we got guys like, who's this? Madoff? Who are we? New York University. We lost 29 million to Madoff and his Ponzi scheme. So you ask yourself, how could that possibly be? Well, we have the president of NYU is giving a talk here. Don't mention this. He was. We have a board of trustees, and Madoff developed relationships with our board of trustees, much of which was ultimately lost. Some was recovered, but ultimately lost. So even large institutions, and presumably financial institutions, were caught in this particular scandal. Others were not, and in this case, some of the big Swiss banks basically stayed away from this particular case. So, what we, if you look at the consequences of all this, for the U.S., I don't know the Korean tax code, but for the U.S., you're taxed on global income. And in other countries, you're taxed on remitted income. So if you earn income abroad, it's not taxed until it's remitted back to your country. But the U.S. is particularly vulnerable to the incentive to use financial secrecy. And if you this is a U.S. tax return, and if you look at the bottom of the first page, it says, what I put down here is true and complete. And if it's not, it says, and this is true and complete, it's a declaration by the preparer or the individual. If it turns out not to be, it's a criminal offense. It's not a civil offense. And that makes a big difference, whether it's a criminal or civil offense. And so in the US, we've had a number of cases where the global secrecy framework has been used to, in this case, evade US federal taxation and also local taxes. Then we have another addition to this, which is called FATCA, where Americans have to not only declare their foreign income, but they also have to declare their foreign assets by type, by location, as well as the flows or the interest and dividend income from that. And this became a big problem because it's, valuing assets is tough. Valuing income flows is significantly easier. And if I had an account in a Swiss bank, the Swiss bank would file a return with the IRS, and I would file the same return, or my return with the IRS, which would then compare the two, and I'd be taxed on that amount. But if I have significant assets abroad, whether it's in whether it's in confidential accounts, or whether it could be physical property or whatever, this makes a big difference in terms of the reporting requirements. So the government's view on this has significantly hardened over the years. So UBS was the first firm that was targeted by the Internal Revenue Service for aiding and abetting tax evasion in the U.S. It was kind of interesting because the UBS position of the board was we do not get involved in this, this is in all the policy statements that the U.S. issued, as well as in their training programs for young bankers and so on. But then, after a while, it turned out compliance with their own policies, as well as compliance with the regulatory authorities, was ignored to a large extent. And so the IRS came in and used these bad words, which is aiding and abetting, helping Americans avoid American taxation. Secondly, ignoring the law, conspiracy and contempt, and obstruction of justice. And all of those are bad words in terms of potential criminal prosecution, which is almost unthinkable for a large financial institution, but also possibly for civil action. So the beginning of the pressure in terms of secrecy from the US began to build pretty significant momentum. But they ignored it. And to some extent, they began remarketing and redeveloping their client base, despite the fact that they already had a IRS mandate not to do that. So using various different techniques. And then there was a whistleblower, Brad Birkenfield, and he was arrested for doing this. And not only that, but he was convicted. So basically, he was operating out of Florida back in 2008. He testified as to what his own actions were, and also what the board, the executive board of UBS policy was, which were actually at variance, and also what the amounts were and how this fed into the management structure of UBS right from the board down to the coverage people who were dealing with wealthy Americans. And this was sort of the beginning of a major change in the market. Ultimately, they surrendered 4,450 accounts, the names of the clients. Remember, these are confidential accounts or non-disclosure accounts. They disclosed the names, how much they had, in what form. And all of that went to the U.S. Treasury Department and the IRS. Now, suppose you had done this. You'd evaded U.S. taxes and had it in the UBS or whatever the firm is. It wouldn't make you very comfortable because they're coming. And that creates a significant amount of tension with respect to the client. And the hope here was that that would, first of all, create disclosure, voluntary disclosure on the part of the individuals concerned. And secondly, on the part of the institutions, that they would come to some kind of agreement to deal with U.S. Tax evasion. And it actually worked out pretty well in terms of the amount of funds recovered and also in terms of the change in policy. And some firms, in this case, like their competitor, Credit Suisse, didn't do that. UBS came forward. Credit Suisse continued not to participate in this, which turns out to be a very big mistake in retrospect because they were fined $4.1 billion or something like that. And that was part of their management, management style, if you want to call it that. And of course, it doesn't exist anymore now. It's taken over by UBS. So these are some of the issues that you have, both with respect to the management of individual institutions, with respect to inter-country flows, with respect to financial management of countries, where confidentiality plays a role. And once we begin to see some relatively reliable data, or more relatively reliable data, and as I mentioned at the beginning, there's significant progress there. We're going to have this with us, both for good and for bad. Thank you very much.